My son did this while giving me a back massage, a tale of betrayal. Some moments linger endlessly, clinging to you like shadows, silent yet ever-present. 2 years have passed since that day. 2 years since everything transformed. What was meant to be straightforward turned into a beach outing with my son Leonard. My husband Phoenix was unable to attend, he never was. Work always took precedence, and I had grown accustomed to that, accustomed to solitude. Yet that day it didn't carry the weight of normalcy, neither in that moment nor in retrospect. We laid out the towels, the sun enveloping us in its warmth, perhaps a bit too intense. I reclined, at last liberated from the clamor of the world. I requested Leonard's assistance in applying some oil to my back. I didn't hesitate at all. He's my son, my boy, why would I? Initially, it was merely his hands, simply assisting me. But then, I felt him linger, lower and lower, and I didn't stop him. Why didn't I intervene? You believe you understand who you are, you believe you grasp the essence of your family. Yet there exists that singular moment, that one fleeting instant, capable of dismantling it all. That day on this beach, something happened to me, and I've never been the same since. Phoenix and I had been united in marriage for more than 15 years. Anyone who knew us would say we were the ideal couple. A lovely home, wonderful children, and a stable existence. Yet, the fissures remain hidden until you step within the confines of the structure. One cannot truly grasp the void unless they are the one experiencing it. For years, Phoenix's job defined his existence. He was constantly immersed in his work, dedicating late nights, weekends, and holidays to his craft. I once convinced myself that his actions were for our benefit. The extra hours, the unwavering commitment, were all for the future he was crafting for our family. However, after a considerable amount of time, that narrative begins to unravel. What value does a home hold if it remains empty and unoccupied? I faded into the background for him. Upon his arrival, he hardly acknowledged my presence. He ceased inquiring about my feelings, my desires, and my needs. Our conversation was brief, focusing mainly on expenses, shopping, and the children. He cherished Leonard and his little sister, Isla, yet even in their company, he felt like a mere shadow. He was present, yet somehow absent. I would sit at the table opposite him, pondering whether he still noticed my presence. That morning, I recall being in the kitchen while Phoenix rushed out the door. He took hold of his briefcase, pressed a kiss to the crown of Isla's head, and cast a fleeting glance in my direction. Apologies, Freya, but I won't be able to attend today. An unexpected situation arose at work. I simply chose not to engage in any argument. I simply nodded as I always did, my throat constricted. I reassured myself that everything was okay. Leonard and I might venture out independently. At 16, Leonard stood tall and lanky, his brown eyes mirroring those of his father, yet his face bore a gentler quality. He remained quiet, even when I mentioned it would only be the two of us. I believe he had received. Accustomed to his father coming to the rescue as well. He merely shrugged, picked up the bags, and trailed behind me to the car. I observed him in the passenger seat during the drive, earbuds in, gazing out the window as teenagers often do. A smile crept onto my face. He was maturing at an incredible pace. And at times I feared that if I blinked, he would slip away from me as well. The journey to the beach seemed to stretch on forever. My thoughts drifted, as they often did, to Phoenix. I reminisced about all the moments we shared, cozy movie nights, leisurely strolls, and spontaneous trips to nowhere just for the sake of adventure. The enjoyment of it. I reflected on how he used to caress me, how his eyes would sparkle at the sight of me. It had been years since I experienced that. I had not experienced anything. I felt utterly exhausted from fading into the background. We finally arrived, and Leonard assisted me in carrying the bags to a serene location by the water's edge. I arranged the towels as he prepared the umbrella. I can't quite pinpoint why I suddenly felt compelled to reach out to him. Perhaps it was due to the fact that he was the sole presence in that moment. Perhaps I simply required someone to listen to me. "Isn't it lovely to step outside, wouldn't you agree?" I remarked, making an effort to sound upbeat. He simply nodded, pushing his. He brushed his hair back with his hand. "Absolutely, Mom, it's lovely." I reclined on the towel, absorbing the warmth of the sun as it enveloped my skin. I remained still for a time. I simply allowed myself to relax, as if I were attempting to shed the burdens of the past few years. Even if just for a fleeting hour. But then I recalled the oil. I propped myself up and faced Leonard. "Could you assist me in applying this to my return?" I inquired. "I am unable to access it on my own." He glanced at me for a moment, a hint of hesitation in his eyes, before reaching for the bottle I held out. I reclined once more. My face pressed against the towel and waited. The initial contact was soft, deliberate. His hands trembled, as if he feared causing me pain. A smile crept across my face, evoking memories of his childhood, when he would take my hand to guide me across the street. His hands were so tiny back then. I encouraged him to apply a bit more pressure. "My voice is muted." "It's all right." He listened intently, his hands becoming increasingly steady as he worked the oil into the surface, over my shoulders and along my back. I shut my eyes and sought to immerse myself in the warmth, the cadence of his caress. For a fleeting instant, I allowed myself to savor it. It had been an eternity since anyone had laid a hand on me, and that realization struck me more profoundly than I cared to acknowledge. But then, I sensed his hands gliding lower, deliberately, gently, along the curve of my back. My breath hitched in my throat, and I parted my lips to speak, yet silence enveloped me. Thoughts surged through my mind, yet I remained quiet. I reassured myself that everything was okay, that he was merely being helpful, that my thoughts were just illusions, but deep down, I knew I wasn't mistaken. His hands lingered for a moment, just above the boundary where my towel lay. I sensed his uncertainty, mirrored by my own, and rather than halting him, I voiced it instead. "It's all right. You can also apply some pressure there." The words lingered in the atmosphere, heavy and toxic, and as soon as they escaped my lips, I realized there was no way to retract them. Leonard remained silent. He continued on without pause. I shut my eyes tight and sensed his hands on me beneath what they ought to have been. My heart raced with such intensity that I feared he could hear it. I felt the urge to shift, to rise, to urge him to cease, yet I remained still. I was unable to. I allowed it to unfold. Even now, I remain uncertain about the reason. Perhaps it was the solitude. Perhaps I was overly eager to experience a sense of belonging, even if it was misguided. Or perhaps I simply didn't care any longer. On that day at the beach, a profound shift occurred within me, and nothing would ever return to its former state. Thank you for staying with me as we journey through this narrative together. I understand it is. It's not simple to absorb, and I'm grateful for your willingness to listen. If you find this video engaging, or if you know someone who might resonate with what I'm sharing, I would appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It truly encourages me to continue sharing narratives like this and reassures me that I'm not isolated in this experience. Okay, let's dive back in. Following that day at the beach, a change occurred. I couldn't overlook it, the emotions that surged within me, the sights that captured my attention, and the way Leonard gazed at me afterward. It was not merely a fleeting glance or a brief encounter. It was unrelenting. Each time our gazes met, I sensed a shift within him, an unnameable quality that lingered in my mind. Impossible to ignore. I attempted to conceal it. Upon returning home that evening, I took action. I did everything I could to behave normally. I prepared dinner. I inquired with Leonard regarding school. I folded laundry late into the night, my hands trembling throughout the process. I continuously revisited all that transpired. The way his hands lingered. The tension coursing through my own body. I despised myself for it, and I resented him for causing me to feel this way about my own son. Phoenix remained completely unaware. He arrived home late. As was his custom, his tie askew, his expression weary. He pressed his lips to my cheek, a mere echo of what it once was. It was a long day, and I inquired, yearning for a bit of dialogue. He grunted and nodded, making his way toward the living room with purpose. It has always been this way. His presence lingered in the background, as if he were merely an afterthought. Once more, I felt like I was fading into the background. That night, I found myself in bed, gazing at the ceiling as Phoenix quietly nibbled beside me. The house lay in silence. Yet my thoughts were anything but still. I found myself lost in thoughts of Leonard, reflecting on his hands and the intensity of his gaze. I realized it was wrong. I realized I needed to put an end to it, whatever it was, before it escalated any further. Yet, there existed another facet of my being, a shadowy, solitary part that yearned to cling to it. That hungered for the attention, the touch, the sensation of truly being noticed. As the days went by, Leonard remained silent. Yet, his silence resonated more profoundly than any spoken phrase. He didn't really steer clear of me, not in a direct way. Rather, it felt as though he remained nearer. He would catch me in moments of solitude, while I cooked, while I cleaned. And even when I sat alone on the couch at night. And I allowed it to unfold. I let him go. I didn't hold back. Then arrived the following weekend. The heat returned, wrapping the house in a suffocating embrace. Phoenix had vanished, caught up in some final task, leaving Leonard and me alone once more, reminiscent of the past. I inquired whether he would like to return to the beach, just the two of us. I can't quite understand what compelled me to do that. Perhaps I believed that being outdoors would aid in clearing my thoughts. Perhaps I sought to challenge myself, to discover if I could set everything aside. The journey was serene this time. Leonard chose not to wear his earbuds, however. He sat there, gazing out the window, his knee bouncing with restless energy. I felt the urge to utter a word, any word. To shatter the stillness that enveloped us. Yet, whenever I attempted to speak, the words became lodged in my throat. Upon our arrival at the beach, we found it nearly deserted. I recall the vibrant hue of the water, the sensation of the wind brushing against my face. I laid out the towels once more, just as I had done previously. And Leonard assisted me in arranging everything. This time, I didn't request him to apply oil on my back. I was unable to. Instead, I remained still with my eyes shut, feigning that all was well. Yet, even with my eyes closed, I sensed his stare. I sensed his gaze upon me. The true turning point arrived later that afternoon. We chose to wash off at the beach showers before making our way home. It was meant to be a swift task, merely to remove the sand from our skin. Yet, an event unfolded at that moment that remains beyond my understanding. Upon arriving at the showers, Leonard was the first to step underneath, allowing the water to cascade down his back. I lingered at the edge, observing him for a moment before I joined in as well. I found myself inexplicably compelled to remove my outer garments and stand beside him. The coolness of water against my skin. Leonard gazed at me, taken aback. Uncertainty hung in the air, whether it was surprise, confusion, or something else entirely. He remained silent. I looked at him then, truly observed him, and said, "You ought to take off your shorts as well. It is essential to rinse thoroughly." I'm not sure what prompted me to say that. Perhaps I sought to demonstrate to myself that I could take charge, that I could bring this to a halt, or Perhaps I was putting him to the test, as well as challenging myself. He paused for a moment, then complied with my request, sliding his shorts off. And there we stood, side by side, enveloped in solitude, the rain cascading over us, cleansing all but the emotions we shared. I turned away from him and whispered, "Assist me with my back," and he complied. His hands moved with the same carefulness as before. Yet the tension was unmistakable. I sensed it within him, I sensed it within myself. As his hand grazed my waist, I felt a sudden stillness wash over me. The atmosphere grew heavy, the rush of the water overpowering all other sounds. I had the option to walk away, I had the power to put an end to it. Instead, I leaned back, drawing closer to him. I extended my hands toward his, leading them to my chest, and in that moment, he remained close, not pulling away. What transpired afterward is beyond my ability to articulate. I shall refrain from providing an explanation. It was a fleeting instant, a haze of yearning, solitude, and an unnamed sensation that lingers just beyond my grasp. It was neither gentle nor unhurried. It was intense, fervent. It was misguided in every sense, yet I found myself unable to halt its course. I had no desire to. As the final moments faded, we remained rooted in place, the relentless cascade drenching us, erasing the signs, yet leaving the truth untouched. He embraced me then, embraced me in a way that no one else had in years, and I surrendered to it. Following that, we fell silent. We dried off, packed up, and made our way back to the car in quietude. I observed Leonard from the out of the corner of my eye. I caught a glimpse of his flushed face, his movements rigid and unyielding. I realized I had destroyed it all. I realized we had stepped over a boundary that could never be undone, and yet, for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The journey back was quiet initially. The vehicle seemed cramped, burdensome, as if the very atmosphere was weighing down upon us. I held the steering wheel firmly, attempting to concentrate on the road ahead, yet my thoughts were in a whirlwind. I could still sense him, Leonard, his hands, his body, the heaviness of everything we had just experienced. I maintained, casting furtive looks at him in the passenger seat. He sat rigidly, gazing out the window, his face flushed and his jaw clenched. Then, unexpectedly, he began to speak. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, tinged with uncertainty. I averted my gaze from him. I was unable to. However, I heard him. "Excuse me. What just occurred back there?" My heart raced with sudden intensity. For a fleeting instant, I considered the idea of feigning ignorance, of dismissing his words, of steering the conversation in a different direction. Yet, the facade had lost its purpose, especially after everything we had done. I inhaled unsteadily and replied, "I don't know." It was the reality, or perhaps the nearest semblance of it. I was completely in the dark about what had transpired or the reasons behind it. All I understood was that everything had transformed. Silence enveloped us once more until we arrived at the driveway. I switched off the engine, yet neither of us made a move. Leonard finally focused on me, truly focused on me. And for the first time, I perceived something in his gaze that filled me with unease. It wasn't bewilderment or remorse or even embarrassment. It was a deep yearning. "For how long have you experienced these feelings?" he inquired. His words sent chills through me, as I had been pondering the very same question. I gazed at him in that moment, and it felt as though a floodgate had opened within me. "I'm not sure," I murmured. Perhaps it's been more time than I'm willing to acknowledge." Silence enveloped us in the darkness, both of us lost in our thoughts. I believed that would be the end. That we would step inside, attempt to erase everything from your mind, and act as if nothing ever occurred. However, Leonard envisioned something different. Just as I was about to open the door, he leaned in and kissed me. It began gently, tentative, as if he feared I might withdraw. However, I did not. I allowed him to kiss me, and I reciprocated the gesture. Then I lost control. I can't tell if it was the solitude, the years of being overlooked, or the way Leonard gazed at me as if I were someone special after such a long time. Yet, I allowed it to unfold. Right there, just outside our home, Leonard drew me close, his hands gliding over me as if they were meant to be there. I experienced a profound sense of vitality. I felt desired. I felt acknowledged. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of indifference towards everything else. Uncertain of the duration we remained entwined, lost in one another, we eventually retreated indoors. I can't recall many details of the walk to the door, only the sensation of his hand in mine, the silence surrounding us humming with an electric energy. We remained silent. There was no necessity for that. As soon as we entered, the situation intensified. It felt as if we had been restraining ourselves for far too long, and now the floodgates had finally opened.